The bruise on Natalie Bishop's cheekbone had faded to a sickly yellow by the time she buried her husband in the hard Texas soil outside Austin in the spring of 1878. But the memory of how she got it would never fade at all. She stood at the graveside in her black dress, the only mourning garment she owned, and felt nothing but relief as the preacher droned on about eternal rest and God's mercy. The other women from town kept their distance. Their whispers carried on the warm breeze that smelled of wildflowers and dust. They thought her cold for not shedding a tear. They didn't know that she had cried all her tears years ago, back when she still believed things might change, back when she still had hope that Martin Bishop might become the man he pretended to be during their brief courtship. The preacher finished his words and the small gathering dispersed. Natalie remained, staring at the fresh-turned earth, thinking about the 5 years she had spent walking on eggshells, measuring her words, trying to anticipate his moods. Martin had been thrown from his horse 3 days ago, his neck broken instantly. The town physician said he died without suffering. Natalie thought that was more mercy than Martin had ever shown her. "Mrs. Bishop." A gentle voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find Mrs. Henderson, one of the few women in town who had ever shown her kindness. "Will you be all right? Do you have family you can go to?" Natalie shook her head. Her parents had died of fever 2 years before she married Martin. She had no siblings, no cousins that she knew of. "I'll manage," she said quietly. "The ranch is mine now." Mrs. Henderson's expression was doubtful. The Bishop Ranch was small, just enough land for a modest herd and a vegetable garden. Martin had never been much of a rancher, preferring to spend his time drinking in town or taking out his frustrations on his wife. "If you need anything, you come find me, you hear?" "Thank you," Natalie said, meaning it. She watched Mrs. Henderson walk back toward town, then turned her own steps toward the ranch, a 2-mile walk that she had made countless times before. The house was quiet when she entered, blessedly quiet. No heavy footsteps, no shouted demands, no sound of a belt being pulled from its loops. Natalie removed her bonnet and sat at the kitchen table, suddenly exhausted. She was 23 years old and felt ancient, worn down to nothing. But she was free. The thought came to her slowly, like dawn breaking over the hills. She was free. Whatever happened now, whatever struggles lay ahead, she would face them without fear of the man who was supposed to protect her. She pressed her hands flat against the rough wooden table and let herself cry, not from grief but from relief so profound, it shook her entire body. The next morning, Natalie woke with the sun and assessed her situation with clear eyes. The ranch had 12 head of cattle, most of them in poor condition. The fence line needed mending. The roof leaked in 2 places. She had perhaps $30 to her name and no idea how to run a cattle operation. Martin had never let her be involved in the business side of things, such as it was. She was feeding the chickens when she heard the sound of a horse approaching. Her body tensed automatically, an old fear rising in her chest, but she forced herself to breathe slowly. Martin was dead. He couldn't hurt her anymore. The rider who came into view was unfamiliar to her. He was tall, sitting easy in the saddle, with dark hair that needed cutting and several days' worth of beard on his face. He wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy, denim and leather worn soft with use, and a hat that had seen better days. As he drew closer, she could see his eyes were a startling blue, almost gray in the morning light. "Morning, madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was deep and polite. "Name's Nathan Anderson. I heard in town that you might be looking to hire some help." Natalie blinked in surprise. "I don't know who told you that. I'm afraid there's been some mistake. I can't afford to hire anyone." Nathan swung down from his horse with the fluid grace of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle. He was young, she realized, probably not more than 25 or 26. "Well, madam, I heard your husband passed recently. I also heard this ranch could use some work. I'm not asking for much, just food and a place to sleep and whatever you can spare when you sell your cattle. I've been drifting for a while now, and I wouldn't mind settling in one place for a season or two." She studied him carefully, looking for the signs she had learned to recognize. The mean glint in the eye, the way some men carried violence in their shoulders, ready to unleash it at any moment. But Nathan Anderson just looked tired and honest, his gaze direct but not aggressive. "Why would you work for almost nothing?" she asked. "There are other ranches around here that could pay proper wages." "True enough," he admitted. "But I heard you were alone out here, and that didn't sit right with me. My mother raised me to help people who needed it." He paused, then added carefully, "I heard some other things too about your late husband. Figured you might not be too keen on having a man around, but I promise you, madam, I'm not like that. These hands have worked cattle and horses and done honest labor my whole life. They've never been raised in anger to a woman or a child or anyone who didn't deserve it." Natalie felt something catch in her chest. She had been married to Martin for 5 years, and not once had he spoken to her with such simple respect. "I see," she said quietly. She looked around at the ranch, at the sagging fence and the thin cattle, and knew she couldn't do it alone. But trusting another man, letting one onto her property, into her space, was terrifying. Nathan seemed to sense her hesitation. "Tell you what," he said, "let me fix that fence over there." He pointed to a section that was barely standing. "Won't take me more than a few hours. You can watch if you like, see how I work. Then you can decide if you want me to stay on or if you want me to ride out. No hard feelings either way." It was a fair offer. Natalie nodded slowly. "All right, the tools are in the barn." She did watch him, though she tried not to be obvious about it. She went about her morning chores, feeding the animals and checking on the garden, but she kept Nathan in her peripheral vision. He worked steadily and efficiently, not hurrying but not wasting time either. He handled the tools with confidence, and he was gentle with the nervous cattle that came near to investigate him. Around midday, Natalie brought him a cup of water from the well. He accepted it gratefully, drinking deeply before handing the cup back. "Thank you, madam. That's kind of you." "You can call me Mrs. Bishop," she said, then hesitated. She didn't want to be Mrs. Bishop anymore, didn't want to carry Martin's name like a brand. Or just Natalie, if that's not too familiar. "Natalie is a pretty name," Nathan said. "I'll stick with Mrs. Bishop for now if that's all right. Want to keep things proper." She appreciated that more than she could say. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, and then Nathan said, "I'm sorry for your loss." The automatic response rose to her lips, the polite thank you that society demanded, but Natalie found she couldn't say it. She had never been a good liar. Instead, she said, "Thank you for your help with the fence." Something shifted in Nathan's expression, a softening around his eyes that suggested understanding. He didn't press further, just nodded and went back to work. By the time the sun was starting its descent toward the horizon, the fence section was repaired and reinforced. Nathan had also taken it upon himself to check the rest of the fence line and make a list of other areas that needed attention. He presented this to Natalie as he prepared to leave. "I can have this done in about a week," he said. "Then we should look at getting those cattle fattened up before you try to sell them, and the roof should be patched before the next rain." Natalie looked at the list, then at Nathan. He was dusty and tired, but there was something calm and steady about him that made her feel, for the first time in years, like things might be all right. "There's a bunkhouse out back," she heard herself say. "It's not much, and it probably needs cleaning, but you're welcome to it if you want to stay on. I can't pay you wages yet, but I can feed you 3 meals a day and give you a percentage when I sell the cattle." Nathan's face broke into a genuine smile, and Natalie was struck by how young he looked, how different from Martin's perpetual scowl. "That's more than fair, Mrs. Bishop. I'll take good care of things around here. You have my word." "There's one condition," Natalie said, her voice firmer than she felt. "The house is mine. You don't come inside unless I invite you. Is that clear?" "Yes, madam," Nathan said without hesitation. "I wouldn't presume otherwise." And that was how Nathan Anderson came to work at the Bishop Ranch in the spring of 1878, and how Natalie Bishop began to learn that not all men were cruel. The first week was tentative on both sides. Nathan worked from dawn until dusk, repairing fences and clearing brush and tending to the cattle. Natalie maintained the house and garden and cooked meals that she brought out to Nathan, never quite meeting his eyes. They spoke in polite monosyllables, dancing around each other like wary animals. But gradually, things began to shift. Nathan had a way with the animals that Natalie admired. The horses, which had been skittish and difficult under Martin's harsh handling, grew calm under Nathan's patient touch. He spent hours working with them, his voice low and soothing, never raising a hand in violence. One afternoon, Natalie was hanging laundry when she heard Nathan singing to one of the horses. His voice was pleasant, carrying a melody she didn't recognize, and she found herself pausing to listen. When she realized what she was doing, she flushed and hurried back to her work, but something had loosened in her chest. It was the small things that got to her. The way Nathan always said thank you when she brought him meals. The way he asked permission before doing anything that might affect her directly. The way he kept his distance, but was always available if she needed help with something heavy or difficult. The way he never, not once, showed any sign of anger or impatience. 2 weeks after Nathan's arrival, a storm rolled in during the night. Natalie woke to the sound of rain hammering on the roof and water dripping into the 2 buckets she had positioned under the leaks. She got up to empty them and saw, through the window, a light in the barn. Nathan was out in the storm, checking on the animals. By morning, the rain had passed, leaving the world fresh and clean. Natalie made breakfast and brought it out to Nathan as usual. He looked exhausted, his clothes still damp. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked. "Not much," he admitted. "One of the cows was having trouble with her calf, but they're both fine now." "You should rest today," Natalie said. "You can't work without sleep." Nathan shook his head. "I want to get that roof patched before the next rain, but I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Bishop." She watched him eat, noting the dark circles under his eyes, and made a decision. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make you a proper breakfast and then you're going to sleep for a few hours." Nathan looked surprised. "I couldn't impose." "You're not imposing, I'm telling you," her voice was firm. "You're no good to me if you collapse from exhaustion." He followed her into the house, moving carefully as if aware he was crossing a threshold. It was the first time he had been inside, and Natalie felt oddly vulnerable having him in her space. But Nathan just sat where she indicated at the kitchen table, hands folded, waiting patiently while she cooked eggs and bacon and fresh biscuits. They ate in silence at first, and then Nathan said, "This is the best meal I've had in months. You're a fine cook, Mrs. Bishop." "Natalie," she said suddenly. "You can call me Natalie. I think we've moved past formalities." Nathan smiled. "All right, Natalie, and you can call me Nate if you like. Most people do." "Nate," she repeated, testing the name. It felt right somehow. After breakfast, Nate went to the bunkhouse and slept for 4 hours while Natalie worked in the garden. When he emerged, looking more rested, he insisted on getting to work on the roof despite her protests. She watched him climb up with tools and materials, her heart in her throat at the thought of him falling, and realized with a start that she cared whether he got hurt. That evening, she invited him to have dinner inside instead of taking it out to him. They sat across from each other at the table, and for the first time, they really talked. Nate told her about growing up on a ranch in Colorado, about his parents who had died in a winter fever when he was 20, about his years of drifting from place to place, never quite finding where he belonged. "What about you?" he asked gently. "Have you always lived in Austin?" Natalie hesitated. She didn't talk about her past, about the years with Martin, but something about Nate's open, honest face made her want to try. "I grew up on a farm about 50 miles from here," she said slowly. "My parents died when I was 18. Martin was a friend of my father's, older than me, and he offered to marry me. I thought it was the answer to my prayers. I had no one, no way to support myself. I thought he was being kind." She stopped, the memories crowding in. Nate waited, not pushing, just listening. "He wasn't kind," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was cruel. He had been friends with my father, so I thought he was a good man, but after we married, everything changed. He drank too much and had a temper. He didn't like me talking to people in town or having opinions about anything, and when he got angry—" She touched her cheek unconsciously, where the last bruise had finally faded completely. "I'm sorry," Nate said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "I'm sorry you went through that. No woman should have to live like that. No person should." Natalie looked at him and saw genuine pain in his eyes, not for himself but for her. It was so foreign to her, this empathy, that she almost didn't recognize it. "It's over now," she said. "He's gone." "And you're not sorry he is," Nate said. "It wasn't a question." "No," Natalie admitted. "I'm not. Does that make me a terrible person?" "It makes you human," Nate said firmly. "And it makes him exactly what he was, a man who didn't deserve you." He paused, then added quietly, "I meant what I said that first day, Natalie. These hands will never hurt you. I know you have no reason to trust that, to trust me, but I'll spend however long it takes proving it to you." Natalie felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them back and nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. From that night on, things were different between them. Not in ways that anyone from town would have noticed, but in small, significant ways. They talked more, shared meals regularly, laughed together sometimes. Nate had a quiet sense of humor that caught Natalie off guard, making her smile when she least expected it. The ranch began to flourish under their combined efforts. The cattle fattened on the improving pasture. The buildings stopped falling apart. The garden produced abundantly. Natalie found herself looking forward to the sound of Nate's footsteps in the morning, to the sight of him working in the fields, to the evenings when they sat on the porch and watched the sun set over the Texas hills. One day, about a month after Nate's arrival, Natalie went into town for supplies. She was loading the wagon when she heard familiar voices behind her. "Mrs. Bishop, how are you managing out there all alone?" She turned to find several of the townswomen gathered nearby, their expressions a mixture of concern and gossip-hungry curiosity. Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, was the one who had spoken. "I'm managing just fine, thank you," Natalie said politely. "We heard you hired a drifter," Mrs. Patterson continued, her tone disapproving. "Is that wise, a young widow alone with a strange man?" Natalie felt her spine stiffen. "Mr. Anderson is helping with the ranch work. It's all perfectly proper." "Of course, dear," Mrs. Patterson said in a tone that suggested she thought it was anything but proper. "We're just concerned for your reputation. You know how people talk." "Let them talk," Natalie said, surprised by her own boldness. The old Natalie, Martin's Natalie, would have shrunk from such confrontation. "Mr. Anderson is a hard worker and a good man. That's all that matters to me." She finished loading her supplies and drove the wagon out of town, her hands shaking slightly on the reins. When she arrived back at the ranch, Nate was working on reinforcing the barn door. He looked up as she approached and immediately came over to help unload. "Everything all right?" he asked, studying her face. "You seem upset." "Just the town gossips," Natalie said. "They're concerned about my reputation having you here." Nate's expression darkened. "I don't want to cause you trouble if you need me to leave." "No," Natalie said quickly, more quickly than she intended. "No, I don't want you to leave. I don't care what they think." They stood there in the fading afternoon light, looking at each other, and Natalie realized with a jolt that somewhere along the way, she had stopped being afraid of Nate. More than that, she had started to care for him, to depend on him, not because she needed him, but because she wanted him around. "Good," Nate said softly, "because I don't want to leave either." The summer months passed in a blur of work and growing comfort. Nate proved to be everything he had promised and more. He was patient and kind, hard-working and honest. He never raised his voice, never showed any hint of the violence that Natalie had learned to expect from men. When she flinched at sudden movements, which still happened sometimes, he would slow down, give her space, wait for her to relax again. They developed routines: breakfast together at dawn, work through the morning, each at their own tasks but aware of the other's presence. Lunch on the porch, sitting in comfortable silence or easy conversation. More work in the afternoon. Dinner together as the day cooled. Evenings spent talking or sometimes just sitting, watching the stars emerge. Natalie found herself healing in ways she hadn't known she needed to. The constant tension she had carried for 5 years began to ease. She slept better, laughed more, felt more like herself than she had since she was a girl. And slowly, carefully, she began to let Nate closer. It started with accidental touches, hands brushing as they passed tools back and forth, shoulders bumping as they worked side by side. Each time, Natalie would tense instinctively, and each time Nate would pull back gently, giving her space, never pushing. But one day in late July, when the heat was oppressive and they were both working to get the cattle moved to a new pasture before the worst of the afternoon sun, Natalie stumbled on the uneven ground. Nate caught her automatically, his hands on her arms, steadying her. For a moment she froze, every muscle taut, memories of Martin's grip flooding back, but Nate's hands were gentle, his touch light enough that she could pull away if she wanted to. He held her only long enough to make sure she had her balance, and then he released her immediately. "You all right?" he asked, concern in his eyes. Natalie took a shaky breath and nodded. "Yes, thank you for catching me." "Always," Nate said simply. That night, Natalie lay in bed and thought about the difference between Nate's touch and Martin's. Martin had grabbed and gripped and held too tight, using his strength to control and intimidate. Nate's touch was careful, respectful, there to help rather than to hurt. The realization made something in her chest ache with an emotion she couldn't quite name. In early August, a group of men rode up to the ranch. Natalie was in the kitchen when she heard the horses, and she felt the old fear spike through her. Strange men usually meant trouble. She went to the door and saw Nate already walking out to meet them, his posture alert but not aggressive. The leader of the group was a man Natalie recognized vaguely from town, a rancher named Hollis who had been friendly with Martin. He looked around the property with an appraising eye that made Natalie's skin crawl. "Afternoon," Hollis said, not bothering to dismount. "We heard the Bishop place was doing well these days. Thought we'd come see for ourselves." "Afternoon," Nate replied evenly. "Is there something we can help you with?" Hollis's gaze moved past Nate to where Natalie stood in the doorway. "Didn't realize Mrs. Bishop had taken on a partner." "Mr. Anderson works for me," Natalie said, coming down the steps. Her voice was steady despite the anxiety churning in her stomach. "What do you want, Mr. Hollies?" "Just being neighborly," Holly said, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Wondering if you might be interested in selling. This is good land, but it's a lot for a woman to handle alone." "I'm not alone," Natalie said, "and I'm not interested in selling." Holly's expression hardened slightly. "Martin owed me some money before he died. I've been patient about it, but I'm going to need to collect eventually." Natalie felt ice flood her veins. She knew nothing about Martin's debts. "How much?" $200, Holly said. "Due by the end of the month." It might as well have been 2,000. Natalie didn't have that kind of money. She opened her mouth to respond, but Nate spoke first. "We'll need to see documentation of that debt," he said calmly. "And Mrs. Bishop will need time to review it with someone who understands legal matters." Holly's eyes narrowed. "You calling me a liar, boy?" "I'm saying that any legitimate debt will have legitimate documentation," Nate replied. His voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "I'm sure you understand that Mrs. Bishop needs to be careful, a widow alone." For a moment, tension crackled in the air. Holly stared at Nate, who stared back, unwavering. Finally, Holly smiled coldly. "Of course. I'll have my lawyer draw up the papers. But the debt is real, Mrs. Bishop, and it will need to be paid." He and his men rode off, leaving dust hanging in the air. Natalie felt her legs go weak and sat down hard on the porch steps. Nate was beside her immediately, not touching but close. "Are you all right?" he asked. $200, Natalie whispered. "I don't have $200. If the debt is real, I'll lose the ranch." "We don't know if it's real yet," Nate said firmly. "And even if it is, we'll figure something out. The cattle are doing well. If we sell them in a few weeks, we should get a good price." "Not good enough," Natalie said. "Not for 12 head. We'd be lucky to get $100. Nate was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Then we'll need to find another way. But Natalie, look at me." She did, and his eyes were fierce with determination. "I'm not going to let you lose this place. I promise you that." "How can you promise that?" she asked, despair creeping in. "You don't even know if it's possible." "Because I'll do whatever it takes," Nate said. "I'll work extra jobs in town. I'll sell my horse if I have to. We'll figure it out together." The word "together" struck Natalie deeply. She realized that for the first time in her adult life, she wasn't facing a crisis alone. She had someone who cared, someone who was willing to fight for her. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why would you do that for me?" Nate looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. "I think you know why," he said softly. Natalie's breath caught. She did know, she realized. She had known for weeks now, had felt it growing between them like a living thing. Nate cared for her, maybe more than cared. And God help her, she felt the same way. But the thought of that, of opening herself to that kind of vulnerability again, was terrifying. "Nate." She started, not sure what she wanted to say. "You don't have to say anything," Nate said gently. "I know this is complicated. I know you need time. I'm not asking for anything, Natalie. I'm just telling you that I'm here and I'm not going anywhere unless you want me to go." That night, Natalie barely slept. She kept thinking about Holly's visit, about the debt that might or might not be real, about the possibility of losing everything she had worked so hard to build. But she also thought about Nate, about the way he looked at her, the way he had stepped up to protect her without hesitation. She thought about Martin, about the 5 years she had spent in fear and pain. She had sworn to herself after his death that she would never let another man have power over her, never put herself in that position again. But Nate wasn't like Martin. He had proven that over and over in the months he had been here. The question was whether she was brave enough to trust that. Whether she was brave enough to let herself feel something for him beyond gratitude and friendship. Whether she was brave enough to risk her heart. The next morning, Nate rode into town to make inquiries about Holly's claim. He returned in the afternoon with grim news. The debt was real. Martin had borrowed money from Holly's 2 years ago to buy cattle that had never materialized. He had been paying it back in small amounts, but there was still a significant balance due. The good news is that it's not quite as much as Holly's claimed, Nate said. The actual balance is $150, but it is legally due, and if we don't pay, Holly's can put a lien on the property. $150 might as well have been a fortune. Natalie sank into a chair, feeling defeated. I don't know what to do. We sell the cattle, Nate said. All of them. I talked to a buyer in town who might be interested. It won't be enough on its own, but it will be a start. And I have some money saved, about $40. I was keeping it for emergencies, but this qualifies. I can't take your savings, Natalie protested. You're not taking it, I'm investing it, Nate said. In this ranch, in our future here. He paused, then corrected himself. In your future here. But Natalie had caught the slip, and it made her heart race. Our future. Nate ran a hand through his hair, looking uncharacteristically flustered. I shouldn't have said that. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, Natalie said. She stood and walked over to where he stood, closer than she would have dared a few weeks ago. Nate, I need to tell you something. He waited, his blue-gray eyes fixed on her face. I'm scared, she said simply. I'm scared of what I'm feeling, of what it might mean. Martin hurt me in ways that go deeper than bruises. He made me believe that I wasn't worth kindness, that I deserved what I got. And even though I know that wasn't true, even though I can see now how wrong he was, there's still a part of me that's terrified of trusting another man. I understand, Nate said quietly. And I would never push you into anything you're not ready for. I know you wouldn't. That's what makes this different. Natalie took a deep breath, gathering her courage. But I also know that you're not Martin. You've shown me that every single day since you arrived here. And I think I'm falling in love with you, Nate Anderson, and that scares me more than anything. The smile that broke across Nate's face was like sunrise. You're falling in love with me. Yes, Natalie whispered. Is that all right, Nate laughed, a sound of pure joy. Natalie, I've been in love with you since the first week I was here. I just didn't think I had any right to say so. They stood there, looking at each other, and then Nate slowly, carefully, reached out to cup her face with one hand. Natalie didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, closing her eyes for a moment to savor the gentleness of it. These hands will never hurt you, Nate said again, the words a vow. I swear that to you, Natalie. Whatever happens between us, whatever we become to each other, I will never raise a hand to you in anger. I will never make you afraid. I promise you that. I believe you, Natalie said, and realized it was true. She did believe him. Nate leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull back, and kissed her. It was soft and sweet, nothing like Martin's harsh, demanding kisses. It was a question and a promise all at once. Natalie kissed him back, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady under her palms. When they pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. Nate rested his forehead against hers. We're going to get through this, he said. The debt, the ranch, all of it. Together. Together, Natalie agreed, and the word felt like hope. The next week was a flurry of activity. They rounded up the cattle and drove them to town, where Nate had arranged for a buyer to meet them. The man looked over the herd with a critical eye and made an offer that was lower than Natalie had hoped, but probably as good as they were going to get. 12 heads sold for $90. Combined with Nate's $40 in savings, they had $130. They were still 20 short. Natalie tried not to despair. She went through the house, looking for anything of value she could sell. There wasn't much. Martin had never been one for fancy possessions, and what little jewelry Natalie had owned had been sold years ago during a particularly bad financial stretch. She found a pocket watch that had belonged to her father, one of the few things she had kept from her old life. It pained her to part with it, but the ranch was more important. The watch sold for $15. They were $5 short. "I'll figure something out," Nate said when Natalie told him. "I can take on some work in town, maybe at the livery or the feed store," but time was running out. Holly's had given them until the end of August, and it was already the 28th. Natalie spent a sleepless night trying to think of options and coming up with nothing. The next morning, Mrs. Henderson came out to the ranch. Natalie was surprised to see her but invited her in for coffee. The older woman accepted and sat at the kitchen table, her expression serious. "I heard about the debt," she said without preamble. "The whole town's heard, truth be told. Holly's has been making sure everyone knows." Natalie felt her face heat with embarrassment. "We're handling it." "I'm sure you are, dear, but I wanted to help." Mrs. Henderson reached into her bag and pulled out a small bundle of bills. "It's not much, but it's $5. I know that's what you're short." Natalie stared at the money, tears springing to her eyes. "I can't take this." "Of course you can. Consider it a loan if that makes you feel better. You can pay me back when you're able." Mrs. Henderson pressed the bills into Natalie's hand. "Your husband was not a good man, Natalie. Everyone in town knew it, even if we didn't say anything. We should have helped you then, and we didn't. Let me help you now." "Thank you," Natalie whispered, overwhelmed by the kindness. "Thank you so much." With Mrs. Henderson's $5, they had exactly what they needed. That afternoon, Nate and Natalie rode into town together and went to Holly's office. The man looked surprised to see them, and even more surprised when Nate counted out $150 on his desk. "I believe that settles Mr. Bishop's debt in full," Nate said coolly. "We'll need a receipt showing the debt is paid." Holly's mouth tightened, but he wrote out the receipt. Natalie took it with shaking hands, hardly believing it was real. The ranch was safe. She hadn't lost everything after all. As they rode back home, Natalie felt lighter than she had in months. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the evening air was cool and pleasant. Nate rode beside her, and when she looked over at him, he was smiling. "We did it," she said. "You did it," Nate corrected. "This is your ranch, your success." "Our success," Natalie said firmly. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Nate. You know that." He reached over and took her hand, and they rode the rest of the way like that, hands linked, two people who had found something precious in each other. That night after dinner, they sat on the porch as had become their habit. The stars were bright overhead, and the sounds of the night creatures filled the air. Natalie leaned against Nate's shoulder, feeling safe and content in a way she had never expected to feel again. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "What do you want to happen?" Nate replied. Natalie thought about it. "I want to rebuild the herd, make this ranch into something real, something successful. I want to prove that I can do this." "You will," Nate said with confidence. "What else?" Natalie hesitated, then said, "I want you to stay, not just as hired help, but as my partner. In the ranch and in everything else." Nate turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Are you sure? I don't want you to feel like you have to offer that just because I helped with the debt." "I'm offering it because I love you," Natalie said. The words were easier the second time. "I love you and I want to build a life with you, if that's what you want too." "It's all I want," Nate said fervently. He cupped her face in both hands, his touch gentle as always. "Natalie Bishop, I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you if you'll let me." "I'll let you," Natalie said, smiling through happy tears. "But there's one condition." "Anything," Nate said. "I don't want to be Natalie Bishop anymore. That name belongs to a life I want to leave behind. When we marry, if we marry, I want to be Natalie Anderson. Nate's eyes widened. Are you proposing to me? I suppose I am, Natalie said, feeling bold and free and wonderfully alive. What do you say, Nate Anderson? Will you marry me? Yes, Nate said immediately. Yes, 1,000 times yes. He kissed her then, deep and passionate, and Natalie kissed him back with all the love and hope and trust she had rebuilt over the past months. They were married 3 weeks later, in a simple ceremony at the church in Austin. Mrs. Henderson stood up with Natalie, beaming with pride and joy. A few of the other townspeople attended, their earlier gossip forgotten, or at least set aside in the face of the obvious love between the bride and groom. Natalie wore a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, and Nate wore his Sunday best, looking handsome and nervous and absolutely perfect. When the preacher asked if they would pledge their love and faithfulness to each other, both of them said, "I do," with voices that rang clear and true. And when Nate kissed his bride, there was not a dry eye in the church, except perhaps for Holly's, who had not been invited and likely would not have come anyway. The wedding celebration was held at the ranch, with food provided by the women of the town and music played by some of the ranch hands from neighboring properties. As the sun set and the party continued, Nate pulled Natalie aside for a moment alone. "Happy?" he asked, pulling her close. "Happier than I ever thought I could be," Natalie replied honestly. She looked up at her husband, still marveling at the fact that she could call him that, and saw nothing but love and devotion in his eyes. "Thank you for finding me, Nate. Thank you for staying." "Thank you for trusting me," Nate replied. "For giving me the chance to love you. These hands held yours when we spoke our vows today, and they'll hold yours every day for the rest of our lives. And they'll never, ever hurt you." "I know," Natalie said, and she meant it with her whole heart. The years that followed were not without their challenges. Ranching in Texas in the late 1870s was hard work, subject to the whims of weather and market prices, and all the unpredictable difficulties that came with raising cattle. But Nate and Natalie faced everything together, partners in truth as well as name. They rebuilt the herd slowly but surely, investing in better breeding stock and improving their land management. Nate's skill with horses became well known in the area, and he began taking on training jobs that brought in additional income. Natalie proved to have a head for business, managing their finances with careful attention and making smart decisions about when to buy and when to sell. The ranch prospered, and so did their marriage. The trust that had been built so carefully in those early months only deepened with time. Natalie never stopped marveling at Nate's gentleness, at the way he kept his promise every single day. He never raised his voice in anger, never lifted a hand in violence, never made her feel small or afraid. Instead, he built her up, supported her dreams, celebrated her successes, and Natalie blossomed under that love and care. The frightened, beaten-down woman who had buried Martin Bishop faded away, replaced by someone stronger and more confident. She laughed freely, spoke her mind without fear, walked with her head high. She became a force in the local community, known for her fairness and her kindness and her willingness to help others the way Mrs. Henderson had once helped her. In the spring of 1880, 2 years after their marriage, Natalie realized she was expecting a child. The news filled her with joy and, if she was honest, a little fear. She had seen too many women die in childbirth, and the thought of leaving Nate alone was unbearable. But Nate was overjoyed and attentive throughout her pregnancy, making sure she didn't overwork herself, and doing everything he could to keep her comfortable. When her time came in late October, Mrs. Henderson and the midwife were there to help, And after a long but uncomplicated labor, Natalie delivered a healthy baby boy. They named him Joshua, after Nate's father. The baby had his father's dark hair and his mother's determined spirit, making his presence known from the moment he entered the world. Nate held his son with the same gentleness he showed in everything, tears of happiness streaming down his face. "Look at him," he whispered to Natalie. "Look at what we made." "He's perfect," Natalie agreed, exhausted but happier than she could express. She looked at her husband and son, at the life they had built together, and felt overwhelming gratitude. This was what love was supposed to be. This safety, this joy, this partnership. Not what she had endured with Martin, but this beautiful, precious thing she had found with Nate. Joshua was followed by a daughter 2 years later, whom they named Sarah. She had her mother's blonde hair and her father's blue-gray eyes, and she wrapped both her parents around her tiny finger from day one. The ranch house that had once been a place of fear and loneliness became filled with laughter and love and the chaos of family life. As the children grew, Nate made sure they understood the importance of kindness and respect. He taught Joshua to be gentle with animals and to treat people with dignity, regardless of who they were. He taught Sarah that she could do anything her brother could do, that being a girl didn't limit her dreams. And both children grew up knowing without question that their parents loved each other deeply, that marriage could be a partnership of equals built on mutual respect and care. The years passed in a blur of seasons and hard work and quiet happiness. The ranch continued to thrive, becoming one of the most successful small operations in the area. Nate and Natalie took on hired hands as the work expanded, always treating them fairly and paying them well. They became known as good employers, people of integrity who kept their word. Mrs. Henderson became a beloved fixture in their lives, a grandmother to their children in all but blood. She passed away peacefully in 1890, surrounded by the family she had helped create through one small act of kindness. Her loss was deeply felt, but her legacy lived on in the compassion and community support that the Andersons continued to embody. By the mid-1890s, Joshua was a young man helping to run the ranch, and Sarah was a spirited teenager with dreams of becoming a teacher. Nate's hair had started to gray at the temples, and Natalie had laugh lines around her eyes that she wore with pride. They had been married for over 15 years, and the love between them had only grown stronger. One evening in the summer of 1895, they sat on the porch as they had done countless times before, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. The sounds of their children's laughter drifted from inside the house, and the land around them was green and thriving. "You ever think about those early days?" Natalie asked, leaning against Nate's shoulder in the familiar, comfortable way they had. "When you first came here?" "Sometimes," Nate admitted. "I think about how lucky I was that you gave me a chance." "I was the lucky one," Natalie said. "You saved me, Nate, in every way a person can be saved." Nate shook his head. "You saved yourself. I just gave you a safe place to do it." He took her hand, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on her palm. "These hands held yours that first day I promised they would never hurt you, and they never have." "No, they haven't," Natalie agreed. She thought about Martin sometimes, though the memories had faded with time and healing. He had tried to break her, had almost succeeded, but she had survived and she had found something better than she ever could have imagined. "You kept your promise." "I always will," Nate said, "for as long as I live." They sat in peaceful silence as the stars began to emerge, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. The ranch that had once represented nothing but pain and fear had become a home filled with love and laughter. The woman who had once flinched at every shadow now moved through the world with confidence and grace. The drifting cowboy had found a place to belong, a family to call his own. As the night deepened and the air cooled, Joshua came out to tell them dinner was ready. Sarah had cooked, he reported with a grin, so they should probably be prepared for anything. They all laughed together and went inside to the warm, lamp-lit kitchen, where Sarah was indeed presenting a somewhat experimental meal with great pride. That night, after the dishes were washed and the children had gone to bed, Nate and Natalie lay together in the darkness of their room. Nate's arm was around her, and Natalie's head rested on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Nate replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Today, tomorrow, and always." Natalie smiled and closed her eyes, feeling safe and loved and deeply, profoundly grateful. The cruel husband was long dead and buried, his memory fading with each passing year. In his place was this good man, this kind and gentle partner who had kept his promise every single day for 17 years. These hands that held her close had indeed never hurt her. They had worked beside her to build a life, had held their children at birth, had touched her with love and respect. They had proven, day after day and year after year, that not all men were cruel, that marriage could be a source of joy rather than pain, that love could heal even the deepest wounds. As Natalie drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the sounds of her family's peaceful breathing and the solid warmth of her husband's presence, she thought about the frightened widow who had stood at Martin Bishop's grave all those years ago. That woman had been so broken, so afraid, so certain that happiness was beyond her reach. But that woman had been wrong. Happiness had come in the form of a dusty cowboy with kind eyes and gentle hands. And from that first tentative trust had grown a love story more beautiful than Natalie could have ever dreamed, a life more fulfilling than she had ever thought possible. The years continued to pass, bringing new challenges and new joys. In 1897, Joshua married a sweet-natured girl from a neighboring ranch, and by 1899, Nate and Natalie were grandparents to twin boys. The family celebrated their arrival with great fanfare, and Nate proved to be just as gentle and loving with his grandsons as he had been with his own children. Sarah, true to her dreams, became a teacher in Austin, beloved by her students for her patience and enthusiasm. She married in 1901 to a lawyer who treated her with the same respect and partnership that she had seen modeled in her parents' marriage. When Sarah's husband asked Nate for his blessing, Nate had only one question: will you be kind to her? Will you treat her as an equal, respect her opinions, support her dreams? "Yes, sir," the young man had replied earnestly. "I love her too much to do anything else." "Then you have my blessing," Nate said, shaking his hand firmly. Later, he told Natalie how proud he was that their daughter would never know the fear and pain that Natalie had endured, that she would start her marriage with love and respect as the foundation. As the new century dawned, Nate and Natalie found themselves in their 40s, still active and engaged with the ranch but gradually turning more of the daily operations over to Joshua. They had worked hard their entire lives, and they had earned some rest. But more than that, they had earned the peaceful contentment that came from a life well lived and a love well tended. They spent their days working in the garden together, visiting with their grandchildren, taking long rides across the land they had built into something prosperous and beautiful. They spent their evenings on the porch, still finding new things to talk about after more than 2 decades of marriage, still making each other laugh, still looking at each other with the same love and devotion that had brought them together. In 1903, on a warm spring day not unlike the day Nate had first ridden up to the ranch 25 years earlier, They celebrated their silver wedding anniversary. The whole community turned out for the party, a testament to the respect and affection that the Andersons had earned over the years. As Natalie looked around at the gathering of friends, family, and neighbors, she felt overwhelmed with emotion. This life, this beautiful, impossible life, was hers. She had survived cruelty and found kindness. She had endured darkness and found light. She had learned to trust again, to love again, to believe in happiness again. And it was all because of the man standing beside her, his hand warm in hers, his eyes reflecting the same joy and love that she felt. Later that evening, when the guests had gone home and the house was quiet, Nate and Natalie walked out to the spot where he had repaired that first section of fence all those years ago. It had been replaced several times since then, but they both still thought of it as special, the place where their partnership had truly begun. "You remember that first day?" Natalie asked. "When you offered to work for almost nothing just to help?" "I remember thinking you were the bravest person I had ever met," Nate said. "Standing there with that bruise still visible on your face, trying so hard to be strong. I wanted to protect you, to give you a safe space to heal." "You did more than that," Natalie said. "You gave me my life back. You showed me what love was supposed to be." Nate pulled her close, and they stood together in the fading light, two people who had become one through years of shared joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges. The land around them was peaceful and prosperous, a reflection of the care and devotion they had poured into it. The house behind them was filled with memories of laughter and love, a home in the truest sense. "These hands," Nate said, holding up his work-worn hands, calloused from decades of hard labor. "These hands kept their promise." "Yes, they did," Natalie agreed, taking his hands in hers and bringing them to her lips to kiss. "Every single day for 25 years they kept their promise. And I have loved you every single day in return." "I don't deserve you," Nate said, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes, you do," Natalie said firmly. "You deserve all the love and happiness in the world, Nate Anderson. Just as I deserve a partner who treats me with kindness and respect, who builds me up instead of tearing me down. We found that in each other, and that's worth celebrating." They walked back to the house hand in hand, past the garden that Natalie had tended for 25 years, past the barn that Nate had rebuilt with his own hands, past the corral where countless horses had been trained with patience and care. Every inch of the ranch bore the mark of their shared labor and love. That night, they lay in bed together, talking quietly about the past and the future. Their children were grown and settled, their grandchildren were healthy and happy, their ranch was secure. They had built something that would last beyond their own lifetimes, a legacy of hard work and integrity and love. "What do you want for the next 25 years?" Nate asked, pulling Natalie close. She smiled in the darkness. "More of this. More mornings waking up beside you. More evenings on the porch. More grandchildren to spoil. More years of working together, laughing together, loving together." "That sounds perfect," Nate agreed. "Though I hope we have more than just 25 years. I plan on loving you until I take my last breath." "And I plan on loving you just as long," Natalie replied. "Thank you, Nate, for everything, for saving me, for loving me, for being the man you are." "Thank you for giving me a chance," Nate said, "for trusting me when you had every reason not to, for loving me back. You made my life worth living, Natalie." They drifted off to sleep in each other's arms, secure in the love they had built and the life they had created. The cruel husband was nothing but a distant memory now, his power over Natalie erased by years of kindness and care. In his place was this good man, this gentle soul who had kept his promise for a quarter century and would keep it for as many years as they had left. The seasons continued their eternal cycle, bringing change and constancy in equal measure. By 1910, Nate and Natalie were in their 50s, their hair graying but their spirits still strong. The ranch had passed fully into Joshua's capable hands, though Nate still helped out whenever he could. Sarah had 3 children of her own now, and she brought them to visit often, filling the house with noise and energy. Nate and Natalie had become the patriarch and matriarch of a growing family, their example of love and partnership influencing generations. Their grandchildren grew up hearing the story of how their grandfather had come to work for their grandmother, and how they had fallen in love while rebuilding a broken ranch and healing broken hearts. In the evenings, when the work was done and the family was gathered, the grandchildren would beg for stories. Nate would tell tales of his cowboy days, of long cattle drives and wild storms and narrow escapes. But the stories they loved best were the ones about how he met their grandmother, how he had promised that his hands would never hurt her, and how he had kept that promise every day since. "Did you know right away that you loved her?" one of the grandchildren asked. "I knew she was special right away," Nate said, smiling at Natalie across the room. "But love grew over time, built on trust and respect and shared experiences. The best kind of love isn't the quick flash of lightning but the steady glow of a well-tended fire." "Your grandfather is very wise," Natalie said with a laugh. "Though he wasn't always so eloquent, I remember a lot of awkward silences in the beginning." "That's because you made me nervous," Nate protested. "You were so beautiful and so strong, and I was just a drifting cowboy who didn't have anything to offer but hard work and an honest heart." "That was everything I needed," Natalie said softly, and the look they shared made their audience fall silent, touched by the obvious depth of feeling that still existed between them after more than 30 years. As the years advanced into the 1910s, Nate and Natalie gradually slowed down, their bodies no longer able to keep up with the ambitions of their minds. But they faced this together as they had faced everything else, with grace and humor and unwavering support for each other. They spent more time in the garden, growing flowers instead of just vegetables, taking pleasure in the beauty they could create. They took long, leisurely walks around the property, reminiscing about the years they had spent transforming it. They sat on the porch for hours, watching the sunset and counting their blessings. Their children and grandchildren visited often, bringing life and laughter to the old ranch house. Joshua and his family lived just over the hill on a portion of land that Nate and Natalie had given them. Sarah came as often as her teaching and family responsibilities allowed, always bringing books and news from town. In 1918, 40 years after Nate had first ridden up to the ranch, they celebrated their ruby anniversary. The celebration was quieter than the silver had been, just family and a few close friends, but it was no less meaningful. Nate and Natalie had beaten the odds, had survived hard times and thrived, had loved each other faithfully for 4 decades. 40 years, Natalie marveled as they sat together that evening. "Where did the time go?" "Into building a life," Nate replied. "Into raising children and running a ranch and loving each other. I wouldn't change a single moment of it." "Not even the hard times?" Natalie asked. "Especially not the hard times," Nate said. "They taught us what we were made of, proved what we could accomplish together, and they made the good times even sweeter." Natalie leaned her head on his shoulder, a gesture made comfortable by decades of repetition. "I never thought I could be this happy. After Martin, after those terrible years, I thought happiness was something that happened to other people, not to me." "I'm glad you were wrong," Nate said, kissing the top of her head. "I'm glad you gave yourself a chance at happiness. I'm glad you gave me a chance to be the one to share it with you. Best decision I ever made, Natalie said. Well, that and not giving up when things got hard. You taught me that I was stronger than I thought. You taught yourself that, Nate corrected gently. I just provided a safe space for you to discover it. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged, the same stars they had watched together for 40 years. The land around them was peaceful, the ranch that had been built on broken dreams and cruel hands now a place of love and legacy. The 1920s brought the modern age to rural Texas, slowly but surely. Cars became more common, electricity reached even the outlying ranches, and the world seemed to be changing faster than it ever had before. But some things remained constant. Love, family, commitment, these were timeless, unaffected by the march of progress. Nate and Natalie moved through their 60s with the same partnership that had defined their marriage from the beginning. When Nate's joints grew stiff with arthritis, Natalie was there to help him with tasks that had once been easy. When Natalie's eyesight began to fail, Nate read to her in the evenings, his voice bringing to life the stories she loved. They had become fixtures in the community, respected elders, whose opinion was sought and whose example was admired. The younger couples in the area often came to them for advice, and Nate and Natalie always had the same wisdom to share. Communicate honestly, treat each other with respect, never let anger or pride come between you, and always remember that marriage is a partnership. In the spring of 1928, 50 years after that fateful day when Nate had ridden up to the ranch, the community threw them a golden anniversary celebration that brought people from 3 counties. It was a testament to the impact they had had, not just on their own family, but on everyone whose lives they had touched. The party was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and music playing and food enough to feed an army. Their children and grandchildren were all there, of course, but so were former ranch hands, neighbors, people from town, friends they had made over 5 decades of living and working in the community. As Natalie looked around at the gathering, she saw the fruits of the life she and Nate had built. Joshua, now middle-aged himself, was a respected rancher known for his integrity and fair dealing. Sarah was the principal of the school in Austin, beloved by generations of students. Their grandchildren were growing into fine young men and women, carrying forward the values of kindness and respect that Nate and Natalie had modeled. When it came time for speeches, Joshua stood to toast his parents. My father once told me that the best kind of love is like a well-tended fire, steady and warm and reliable. That's what I've watched my parents share for my entire life. They've shown us all what marriage should be, what partnership looks like, what it means to keep your promises even when it's hard. Dad promised Mom that his hands would never hurt her, and for 50 years, he's kept that promise. That's the kind of man I've tried to be, the kind of husband I've tried to be, because of the example he set. Mom and Dad, thank you for loving each other so well and for teaching us all how to love. There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd as Joshua sat down. Nate and Natalie stood together, hands clasped, looking out at the sea of faces that represented their life's impact. We don't deserve all this fuss, Nate said, his voice rough with emotion. We've just lived our lives the best way we knew how. But that's the point, Sarah called out. You've shown us how to live well, how to love well. That's worth celebrating. The party continued into the evening with music and dancing and storytelling. As the sun set, painting the sky in the brilliant colors of a Texas spring evening, Nate pulled Natalie onto the makeshift dance floor. They moved slowly to the music, their bodies knowing the rhythm of each other after 50 years. 50 years, Nate murmured. I can hardly believe it. Best 50 years of my life, Natalie replied. Thank you, Nate, for all of it. for the life we've built, the family we've raised, the love we've shared. Thank you for being exactly who you are. Thank you for trusting me, Nate said. For giving me the chance to prove myself, for loving me back. You've made every day of the last 50 years worth living. They kissed then, to the cheers and applause of their family and friends, a kiss that was both celebration and promise. 50 years together and still in love, still partners, still each other's safe harbor. As the years moved into the 1930s, Nate and Natalie faced the challenges of advancing age with the same grace they had faced everything else. Their bodies slowed, their energy waned, but their love for each other never diminished. They spent most of their time at home now, content to let the world come to them rather than chasing after it. The ranch was firmly in the hands of the next generation, thriving under Joshua's management. The legacy that Nate and Natalie had built was secure, would continue for generations to come. They had accomplished everything they set out to do and more. On a quiet evening in early spring of 1935, 57 years after Nate first rode up to the ranch, they sat together on the porch as they had done thousands of times before. The air was soft and warm, carrying the scent of the wildflowers that Natalie had planted years ago. The sound of their great-grandchildren playing in the yard was like music. "I've been thinking," Natalie said quietly, her hand in Nate's. "About what?" Nate asked. "About that day you came here. About how my life might have gone if you hadn't shown up. About how grateful I am that you did." She turned to look at him, seeing the face she had loved for more than half her life, lined now with age but still beautiful to her. "You saved my life, Nate Anderson. In every possible way you saved my life. And you gave mine meaning," Nate replied. "I was just drifting before I found you, no real purpose, no real home. You gave me all of that. You gave me everything." They sat in peaceful silence, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. This life they had built together, this family they had raised, this love they had nurtured, it was more than either of them could have hoped for that day when Nate rode up looking for work, and Natalie took a chance on trusting again. "These hands," Nate said softly, holding up his aged, work-worn hands. "These hands kept their promise. For 57 years they kept their promise." "Yes, they did," Natalie agreed, taking his hands in hers and holding them close. "Every single day you kept your promise. And I have loved you every single day in return." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Natalie rested her head on Nate's shoulder one last time, feeling his steady heartbeat, his solid presence beside her. They had come so far together, overcome so much, built something beautiful out of broken pieces. The cruel husband was long forgotten now, erased by decades of kindness and care. In his place was this good man, this gentle soul who had proven that not all hands hurt, that some hands build and heal and love. Nate had promised that his hands would never hurt her, and for 57 years, through youth and middle age and into their golden years, he had kept that promise faithfully. And in keeping that promise, he had given Natalie something more precious than she could have imagined. A life worth living, a love worth celebrating, and the knowledge that she was worthy of both. As they sat together on the porch of the ranch they had built together, surrounded by the evidence of their love and legacy, Nate and Natalie Anderson were content. They had faced the darkness and found the light. They had survived cruelty and created kindness. They had turned a broken ranch and broken hearts into something whole and beautiful and lasting. The story of the cowboy who vowed that his hands would never hurt the widow they were helping, and who kept that vow faithfully for more than half a century, became a legend in that part of Texas. Their descendants told it to their children and grandchildren, a reminder of what love could be when built on respect and trust and unwavering devotion. And on quiet evenings, when the sun painted the Texas sky in brilliant colors and the air was soft with the promise of spring, those descendants would gather on that same porch and remember Nate and Natalie Anderson, who had shown them all that even the deepest wounds could heal, that even the darkest nights ended in dawn, and that love, true love, was worth any wait, any struggle, any leap of faith required to find it. Their story ended not with drama or tragedy, but with peace and fulfillment, exactly as it should. Two people who had found each other when they needed it most, who had built a life together through hard work and dedication, who had loved each other faithfully from beginning to end. It was a simple story in many ways, but it was real and true and beautiful, and it endured long after they were gone, a testament to the power of a promise kept and a love well lived.